So the first article I wanted to look at is titled 27% of White Evangelicals Think QAnon is Real. This is by Hemant Mehta on the Friendly Atheist website. So let's give it a read and see what it has to say. More than a quarter of white evangelicals believe in QAnon, suggesting that people whose lives revolve around one conspiracy theory have a very hard time abandoning a different one. That number comes from a January survey conducted by the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative research group which found that 29% of Republicans and 27% of white evangelicals believe the insane conspiracy that says, among other things, Donald Trump has been secretly fighting a group of that includes prominent Democrats and Hollywood elites. So I've been talking about QAnon for a long time. It's definitely a political cult without a shadow of a doubt. I've given my own personal estimates of the sizes of each group. With the evangelical group, we actually have solid numbers, or reasonably solid numbers, right? So I wanted to talk about how big evangelicalism is and why we should be worried about that, and how big QAnon is. Now, previously, I estimated QAnon was roughly 17 million people. I estimated it was between 14 million and 17 million. That was my guess. It was an educated guess, but a guess nonetheless. So I went and looked up the statistics for evangelicalism. This is on a Wikipedia article. I know, don't get me started on how credible Wikipedia is. I know it's not terribly credible, but they do have sources that you can click on and check. But I wanted to look at the demographics information here. Anywhere from 6% to 35% of the U.S. population is evangelical, depending on the definition. Now, based on my definitions, I would put it somewhere around the 25 to 30% range. That's pretty traditional standard evangelical. It can get a lot more narrow if you're counting certain specific groups that consider themselves evangelical but aren't, by standard definitions, things like that. But as Wikipedia here says, the Barna Group reported that 8% of Americans in 2006 were born-again evangelicals, defined as those who answered yes to these 9 questions. Have you made a personal commitment to Jesus that's still important to your life today? Do you believe that when you die you go to heaven because you've confessed your sins and have accepted Jesus as your Savior? Is your faith very important in your life today? Do you have a personal responsibility to share your religious beliefs? Does Satan exist? Is eternal salvation possible through grace, not works? Did Jesus live a sinless life on earth? Is the Bible accurate in all that it teaches? I.e., is it inerrant? And is God the all-knowing, all-powerful, perfect deity who created the universe and still rules it today? So by those, if you answered yes to those questions, then you were considered an evangelical. In reality, there are more layers of complication to it than that. But, you know, those types of surveys give us a little bit of context. So my estimate is about 25%, educated guess, of the U.S. are evangelicals, which puts them around 82 million. It's about 82 million people, which should be concerning to everybody, considering the fact that 70 million Catholics are in the U.S. So evangelicals are basically the largest religious demographic, I would say, as far as I can tell. To put that into context, we've got 70 million Catholics, remember 82 million evangelicals, 1.3 million Jehovah's Witnesses in the U.S., 8.5 million worldwide, 40,000 Scientologists. These are tiny fucking numbers compared to where evangelicalism is right now. So according to this survey by American Enterprise Institute, they qualified white evangelicals versus normal evangelicals because some traditional black churches are considered evangelical churches, even though they aren't really part of the same evangelical demographic that we're talking about. So 27% of white evangelicals identify as QAnon. So 27% of 82 million is in the ballpark of 22 million. Remember, my estimate originally was 14 to 17 million. Turns out, according to this survey, it's about 22 million. That should be fucking scary. That should be scary. Let's keep reading the article and see what else Hemant Mehta had to say here. Those numbers are much higher than those of other political or religious demographics. This is a quote from the study, I believe. Asked to explain why white evangelicals appear disproportionately likely to embrace conspiracy theories, AEI, which is American Enterprise Institute, people who did the survey, AEI's Survey Center on American Life director Daniel Cox noted that as a group, they do not fit a stereotype of conspiracy theorists as people disconnected from social interaction. Instead, most retain strong connections to various social groups. There is a big difference there between them and traditional cults, although I do believe that evangelicalism is, at the very least, a heavy cult mindset. And I would venture as far as to say it's a cult, although it's not a very specific, clearly defined group necessarily, with a hierarchy or anything, but that doesn't necessarily matter in the context of cults. Let's keep reading. This is back to the survey. But white evangelicals stand out in a different way. The vast majority say some or a lot of their family members, 81%, or friends, 82%, voted for Trump in the 2020 election, more than any other religious group. People who do strongly believe in these things are not more disconnected, they are more politically segregated, Cox said. The resulting social echo chamber, he argued, allows conspiracy theories to spread unchecked. This is back to Hemant Mehta. Cox doesn't say this to Religion News Service, but a poisonous echo chamber where bad ideas take off and unverified beliefs provide the foundation for the ecosystem, and where people are praised for just having faith in nonsense is just a perfect place for political lies to thrive. QAnon assumes the best of Trump, the worst of Democrats and/or Hollywood, bizarrely. Why Hollywood? And allows true believers to think they're fighting some religious battle. It's no wonder that the people who constantly start culture wars over innocuous things are more than willing to accept QAnon batshittery. I prefer the word shenaniganery. I'm trying to bring that word into public use. I would really appreciate it if all my viewers and my subscribers started using the word shenaniganery more. I fucking love that word. Anyway, back to what we were saying. These are the same people who think there's a push to stop people from saying Merry Christmas, that they're constantly being persecuted, that evolution is a hoax, and that comprehensive sex education is somehow bad for children. They don't have the critical thinking skills necessary to accept reality in any form. If anything, they're praised in church for running away from those realities. Remember that a different survey from last month found that 49% of Protestant pastors said they'd heard conspiracy theories among members of their churches. If church leaders are disturbed by how gullible and deranged members of their congregations are, they have the power to do something about it. They can speak out against political lies without endorsing a candidate. Yeah, this bit right here, without endorsing a candidate, that's extremely important. They're not legally allowed to endorse candidates in church. If you do that, you're breaking the Johnson Amendment, and you will get in a lot of shit for it, seriously. If you outright endorse a political candidate in church, you can have your tax-exempt status removed. In fact, I could be wrong, but I think Robert Jeffress is going through that right now. He endorsed Mike Pence for 2024 publicly, and he's being investigated for it right now. Like I said, it's not a criminal thing. It's a civil thing. I think he can have his tax-exempt status removed by the IRS for doing it. So we'll see how it plays out. Probably nothing will come of it, but that's pretty serious. You can't do that shit in church. Anyway, let's keep reading. They can provide mental help to members of their flocks. They can emphasize how being a follower of Jesus means never accepting lies, even from people who hand you right-wing judges on a silver platter. Exactly. Have some fucking principles, man. I understand Trump is going to get some things done that you want, but think of what he is and what he stands for. Seriously, he is so completely opposite of what evangelicals are, or what they purport to be, or what they claim to believe in. Donald Trump is none of that, and they know that. How can you justify this shit to yourself? Let's get back to it. The reason they won't do that, though, is because there's just way too much overlap between the sort of mindset that leads to QAnon acceptance and the mindset that leads people to accept the Bible as literally true. You can't tell people to abandon one kind of thoughtless and evidence-free belief while urging them to embrace a different one. You can't say there's no secret cabal of Democrats when the other side of your mouth says Adam and Eve literally existed and Jesus rose from the dead. Not with a straight face, anyway. But they do. They still do. That's true. It's a serious cognitive dissonance problem. Like, people don't realize the complete absurd hypocrisy that comes from their mouths sometimes. It's genuinely embarrassing for them to watch some of these people say some of the shit that they do. Last week, we were talking about Jim Bakker. He was in a video where he said, Christians don't riot. Christians don't do this thing or that thing. They weren't Christians at the Capitol. That's fucking strange, because just weeks before, or over the course of the previous 4 years, Jim Bakker had spent all that time trying to whip people into a blood frenzy, basically. Saying that if Democrats keep doing what they're doing, or whatever, you're going to see little old church ladies out here rioting. That's what he said, word for word. There's just an embarrassing, disgusting cognitive dissonance and hypocrisy happening right now among the evangelical movement. And I don't know how they sleep at night. Like, how do they square this circle in their minds? Anyway, let's keep reading. You also can't rid your church of radical right-wing zealots because, like the Republican Party at large, you'd be casting off a large chunk of your base. Pastors are much more interested in self-preservation. They need those QAnon crazies to give them money, or else some of them won't have a functional church. The problem isn't just that white evangelicals accept QAnon. The problem is that the same kind of thinking required to be a white evangelical opens the door for all kinds of other baseless beliefs. You can't just cut off one arm of the monster and act like the problem is solved. You have to get rid of the monster entirely. That's a really good point on Hemant Mehta's part, and I want to point something out here. Let me read this paragraph again. Pastors are much more interested in self-preservation. They need those QAnon crazies to give them money, or else some of them won't have a functional church. The thing about religion is it affects a different part of your brain than normal, standard, everyday beliefs in any other capacity. Religion acts on your brain in a similar way to drugs. Seriously. I mean, we talked about this in psychology classes in college. Religion acts on the same parts of your brain as drugs. That's why the NA and the AA program, like the 12-step program, that's why they integrate God so heavily into it in the first place, was because they're trying to get people to replace the drugs with God. And it's reasonably effective, although morally wrong and ethically wrong. Should not do that, seriously. But that's why they do it. When you have something that affects your brain in such a powerful way, like God does, and like politics do to some extent, when you integrate politics into religion seamlessly, you form out the most zealous, radical people alive who are literally willing to die for your cause, your political cause. When you mix religion and politics together, it ends badly every time. That is why churches should lose tax-exempt status. The Founding Fathers knew this. Psychologists know this. We have known this for decades, even centuries. Mixing politics and religion is morally and ethically wrong, and it's dangerous.